Okay, my name is Harry Hartman, videographer, and I represent Accurate Vision in Grenada Hills, California. The date is September 14, 2005. Time is 9:04. We're in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Okay, and the court reporter may place the witness under oath.
Dr. Dunbar, if you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand, you swear that the testimony you're about to give and the following proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
Dr. Dunbar, may I have your full name, please?
Yes. And my name is Geoffrey Charles Dunbar.
And when did you decide to go into psychiatry? What year?
About 1976. 75.
Okay.
75, I think, yes.
And then how long was your residency in psychiatry?
I was trained and worked in psychiatry for the next 4 years. And that was at the, the Maudsley Hospital and the Institute of Psychiatry in London.
Moseley?
The Maudsley, that's Maudsley, Maudsley Hospital and Institute of Psychiatry in London.
And that was until 79?
79, yes. Yeah.
Now, at that point or at some point thereafter, did you get the equivalency of, the UK equivalency of board certification?
Yeah, I did, that's correct.
And what is that called? The formal title?
Member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
You have to take a test for that?
Yes, you do.
Written and oral?
Yes, yeah.
And I'm sure you passed with flying colors?
Thank you, yes.
Okay.
First attempt.
And then what did you do professionally starting in 1979?
I started working for a mid-sized European pharmaceutical company called Organon. They were located in the Netherlands.
Why did you decide to take a job with a pharmaceutical company?
As a trainee, in my training in psychiatry, I was much more biologically orientated than many of my fellows. I didn't enjoy particularly or feel the psychotherapeutic approach was very useful, and much preferred, as I say, a more biological approach involving medicines, involving behavior therapy, involving cognitive therapy. I also enjoyed the research side of things, and to continue as a general psychiatrist in the UK. Your time is so full of seeing patients, there's little time to do research. So the idea or the prospect of moving to the pharmaceutical industry, specializing in developing medicines for psychiatric illness, was attractive for me. And it also meant that I was involved in full-time research, which is also what I wanted.
So let me take your chronological path here through from 79 up until the time you started working for, whether it's Beecham Laboratories or Smithkline Beecham, I don't know yet. But please, let's go somewhat quickly, and then if I have questions, I'll stop you. But go from 1979 upward into the 80s, if you will.
Yes, sure. I worked for Organon for approximately 4.5 years. I then returned to the UK and worked for Wyeth Hearst. That's W-Y-E-T-H, yes.
And that would have been about, what, 83 or 4?
84 to 86.
And you were in the UK with Wyeth?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what were your duties at Wyeth?
I was in charge of running the CNS clinical trials in Europe. It was a European medical center.
So you left Wyeth, what, 86 or 7? And then
87, and joined Beecham Pharmaceuticals.
In what position?
I was, again, director of CNS discovery.
And in '87, we were in the commencement of Paxil or paroxetine trials, correct? With Beecham Laboratories?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Where were you physically located when you worked for Wyatt?
In London.
Okay, and then in '87, when you took the Beecham job, where were you physically located in your employment?
Again, it was in London, but in my years there, we moved actually 3 times.
And was the Paxil or paroxetine new drug application filed with the FDA in November of 1989?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. We'll go back here at this period of time, but let's just finish your chronological history. So you stayed at Beecham Laboratories until they became Smithkline Beecham?
Correct.
Okay. And just for purposes of this deposition, I may misspeak at times, and whether I speak of Beecham or Smithkline Beecham or GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, I'm speaking of the same entity.
Yes.
Which was your employer throughout. So is that okay with you?
Yes, sure.
Okay. And what were your duties when you came to Beecham and then Smithkline Beecham?
Initially, my duties were to actually set up a clinical development organization, Beecham CNS Medicine. They didn't have that capability, so I was brought on board to build up a department that would be in charge of developing the clinical development of their CNS medicines.
And other than paroxetine, what other CNS medications were being studied at that time?
Paroxetine was the main medicine.
Mm-hmm.
In CNS, that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you maintained that position for how long at Smithkline?
Smithkline, I was there for just under 10 years.
So you left in 1997?
Correct.
Okay. And you more or less maintained that job description for 10 years. I assume the job description elevated slightly with time.
Yes, that's right. I started off at the director level and then was promoted to the VP level, a little just after the merger.
After the November of '89 merger?
Yeah, yeah.
And then you stayed a VP until '97?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, we'll go back a little bit now on the history. So when you arrived at Beecham in '87 and it became Smithkline Beecham,
Mm-hmm.
the phase 3 trials for paroxetine were pretty much, if not completed, they were well underway in several sites, were they not?
They were ongoing, yes, that's right.
I would assume that when you came on and were in charge of paroxetine trials, that the design of clinical trials was an important issue for you for future development of the drug.
Yes.
And were you aware of the Prozac clinical trial results as they had been publicized with Eli Lilly's application to the FDA and the hearings with Prozac?
I was aware of them, but not in any great detail.
When did you ever at some point start considering the suicide issue and its impact with paroxetine and the paroxetine trial program?
Oh yes, yeah.
And can you give me a year when that first kind of settled with you that this is an issue that I will have to consider?
Right.
What year? Can you give me a year?
Well, as you mentioned, most of the clinical trials were ongoing when I joined the organization. My first big activity was to bring to pull all the results together of those trials and bring together the dossier, the NDA and the MAA dossier. And it was during the preparation of that dossier, the MAA, the MAA NDA, that I wanted to interrogate the paroxetine data to see whether there was any suggestion that there may be some increased suicidality with paroxetine.
What can you try, if you can, to give me a year when you started to focus on that?
Well, it must have been at least, I would guess 1998. Sorry, 1988.
1988.
Yeah.
Okay. So 1988, you begin to look at the issue.
Yeah, look at the data, yes.
You realized at that point, did you not, that the trials conducted heretofore for both paroxetine and Eli Lilly for Prozac never specifically tested the suicide hypothesis for the patients? Is that a fair statement?
No, that's correct. I mean, in clinical trials, you said, typically you have one hypothesis and you test that hypothesis. And in all of the trials, the hypothesis was, paroxetine is a more effective antidepressant than placebo.
So that hypothesis, specific hypothesis, was never tested, and it was never tested up through the time you departed Smithkline Beecham in 1997. Isn't that correct?
In the main, that is correct. Yes.
Now, you said you interrogated the data, correct? And what did you, let's just take a point in time. Let's just say 1990. If you can focus on 1990. When you were interrogating the data at that point, what were you finding in regard to suicide?
Well, we had already sort of interrogated the data and completed the data by the time we put the NDA and the MAAs together. So actually, in those documents, you will see the results of that interrogation, or if you like, those post hoc analyses.
Such as.
And we looked at suicidality in 3 different ways. And remember, these, as you've already indicated, these were not prospective trials. These were post hoc analyses. We had the data, so there was no way of doing anything other than these post hoc analyses. And so we basically did 3 different sorts. One was looking at changes in the suicidality item on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. The other was looking at the number of attempted suicides. And the third was to look at the actual frequency of suicide.
In fact, weren't you one of the prime movers on getting the literature out to the world so they would accept paroxetine in advance of the FDA approval? Am I wrong in assuming that you were a key mover in that for Smithkline Beecham?
As a senior person, as a senior psychiatrist working with paroxetine, though I would be seen as somebody who would be carrying the light or championing the molecule and taking it outside of the organization, spreading the word outside the organization.
Were you aware, when you prepared this report in early '91, that the 2 placebo suicides were washout and run-in suicides?
No, I was not aware.
Now, on the attempted suicides, were you aware that 5 of the 6 placebo attempted suicides occurred during washout and run-in?
No, I was not aware.
And you became aware of that only very recently?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do you deny specifically that you had knowledge that there were washout and run-in events that you had published under non-washout and run-in events? Do you deny that you specifically did that on purpose?
Yeah, I deny that I did not know at the time of those publications, or those reports, should I say, in subsequent cases, that those 5 of the 6 were occurred during run-in.
And is the same answer for the 2 completed suicides
Yes.
for placebo?
Yes, it is the same answer.
Data, whether it was through oversight or negligence or intent or whatever the reason, that publication of published data was invalid, wasn't it?
Well, Mr. Beaver, all I can say is that, you know, these analyses were undertaken by the vice statistician Mike Tideman back in '88. You know, they were in the MAA, and basically they've been perpetuated. You know, an oversight, or I don't know what you would call it, that was generated in the initial analysis, I say back in '87 or '88. It was put into tables, it was put into the MAA, and then basically got perpetuated.
Well, regardless of intent here, isn't it true that public health on SSRIs for paroxetine was greatly misserved by your publications of this data in 91 and 92 and up through 95,
Yeah.
being valid paroxetine figures, not designated with an asterisk for washout or run-in? That was a misservice to public health, wasn't it?
It was an error.
Okay. But I mean,
I think if I'd been aware of that, the fact that 5 of the 6 were on placebo, I think I would have presented the data differently.
okay. Now, we talked earlier about your publication and you being kind of the principal player in publicizing the safety and efficacy of paroxetine for several years, right?
Yes.
Particularly when the product was getting off the ground. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Knowing what you know now, and looking back at what was published here on paroxetine, is it your intent to go off and inform, first of all, Stewart Montgomery that this data was wrong, that was published under his name as well?
I hadn't planned to do that. I had not planned to do that.
Well, you didn't know these figures when you came. Well, okay, I won't get into that. But you didn't know these figures until recently, right?
The part about the events occurring in run-in, that's new. That is relatively new information. That's
Okay.
correct.
Are you inclined to do anything to correct the record, such as notifying GlaxoSmithKline that your authorship was incorrect?
Yeah. Again, that was not my intent,
Why?
because I think GlaxoSmithKline are very well aware of the issues we're discussing now.
Now, would you agree with me that there's various ways to do this? You could go publish your own article to the world in scientific literature that said, I was totally wrong and I got bad information from the company and so forth, but I didn't do it intentionally. That would be one option as I see it. And you could do that, right? One option.
That's one option.
Okay, another option would be to go to GlaxoSmithKline and says, look, I'm really sorry, but I appeared to have been a vehicle for the publication of what was false suicide statistics that could have broad ramifications for 15 years. And I want to report that to you, and I'm willing to work with you on how best to correct that in the public record. That would be another option. Now, another option would be to talk to your co-authors, David Dunner, and said what you've discovered. That would, and to Stewart Montgomery, right? And to see if an article that you published in '95 needs to be corrected, right?
Yes, that's another possibility.
And another possibility is to notify the ACMP of essentially the same thing, that the article appeared in there, and now we know the figures came from thus and such. Correct?
Correct.
Okay, now I want to get these on the record of the, well, let me ask you this. Your findings, of which you were an author, had a major impact on the world's view of the safety of paroxetine. Would you argue with that statement I made?
If people who've read the article presumably will be influenced by it.
Okay, Exhibit 11 is an article from European Neuropsychopharmacology from 1995 versus 1995 5-13. Did you co-author this scientific article, Exhibit 11?
Yes.
And did you rely on the data that you had talked about earlier in getting paroxetine suicide death?
Yes.
You wouldn't question my assertion that the data in this article and the ACNP statement has made it into various scientific literature journals over the last 12 years.
It has, yes, you've provided them.
Would you look at Exhibit 8 in your stack?
Yes, got it.
Okay, look at page 23 if you would. See the section Death, Suicides?
Yes.
Read the last sentence if you would in that first paragraph.
2 of 5 placebo suicides occurred during run-in.
So from this document, Dr. Brecker knew that run-in events were being included.
Yes. Yes.
And if, as I understood your testimony a few minutes ago, Dr. Brecker was not only provided with summary reports, he was also provided with underlying data as part of the NDA application.
Yes.
So if he wanted to go back and look at the details of those individual reports, whether they be suicides or suicide attempts, he had that data available to him.
Absolutely. And that's an important aspect of the FDA's position. They demand the original data to be there so that the reviewers have access to it, and they don't have to take in necessarily for gospel what our summary reports are saying. They can check it out, and that's the whole. That's how it operates.
So if Dr. Brecker wanted to go back and see when in time a placebo suicide attempt occurred, that underlying data was available to him to go back and look at.
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
You can answer.
Yeah, he has all of the data is filed with the agency.
So
All of the data, even down to the individual patient case record form, is filed there. So absolutely, the data were there for him to observe if he so desired.
he didn't have to take the company's word for it.
That's what I said. And very often the agency doesn't. And as I again also indicated earlier, not only do they not accept necessarily what we say, they reanalyze our data to double check.
You mentioned in response to Mr. Farber that the company, your understanding was, included run-in events as part of its analyses because it was trying to give the totality of the data.
That's right.
Did the company also report on events that occurred while patients were taking Paxil during open-label extensions or after the trials were completed?
Yes, of course. I mean, as I indicated, it was an attempt to show the totality of the data. So that's run-ins, the controlled clinical trial part, the controlled part of the trial, and any follow-ons that occurred.
And one way of looking at the issue of whether Paxil causes suicidality, either suicides or suicide attempts, one way of doing an analysis would be to look at the controlled phases of placebo-controlled trials, where you are comparing patients taking Paxil during the controlled phase and patients taking placebo during the controlled phase. Is that a way of doing that analysis?
Well, I would say that it's more than a way of doing it. I would say that's the right way to do it. That's the scientific, that's the methodologically sound way of doing it.
And that would be, then you would be comparing apples to apples.
Yes.
You wouldn't be looking at run-ins, you wouldn't be looking at open labels.
That's exactly right.
And patients would be on either Paxil or placebo for the same period of time.
Correct.
You were asked earlier about what you would do now that you know that the report submitted in 1991 to the FDA and certain of your papers did not have an indication that there were some placebo events that occurred during the run-in.
Yes, that's right. And some of them, and also some of them didn't include the correction for patient-adjusted year, which is another appropriate scientific methodology, which a number of those papers did not include.
I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Deposition Exhibit 19. And this follows my question of earlier of what you would do now that you know that there were certain placebo run-in events that were counted and that were not noted as run-in events. And I believe you testified earlier one of the things you might do, in response to Mr. Farber's question, is to go to the company and talk to them about what their data showed.
Yes, that's what I said, because my assumption is that the company will have undertaken further analyses, maybe even further clinical trial work,
And
which I am not aware of, but my assumption is that that would have happened.
well, I'm going to show. I want you to take a look at Exhibit 19, and there's a chart on the second page, which indicates that when one looks at the controlled portions of the placebo-controlled trials from the data that forms the basis of the 1991 suicide report that we've been talking about, that there were 5 suicide attempts on paroxetine over a denominator of 921, and there was 1 suicide attempt on placebo over a denominator of 544, yielding a p-value...
544?
554, excuse me, yielding a p-value of 0.42. What is your reaction to those numbers?
That's a very for me. Those are very very interesting and rather compelling numbers. As I've said already, my belief is that controlled clinical trials, that's where you get the real data. There's no confounding by time. There's no confounding by running. They're just there. It's just head-to-head comparison. And the fact that there is no difference. There's no statistical difference between these two numbers, I think is very, very important.
And does this data suggest to you that Paxil was causing a statistically significantly higher number of suicide attempts than placebo?
Clearly not. These data indicate exactly the opposite.
So does that allay any concerns that you may have had when you learned that some of the some of the placebo suicide attempts during run-in, and that was not noted in the report or in your papers?
But I find these numbers very, very reassuring, yes, for myself, and I think for the company, and I think for patients.
Let me show you what's been marked as Deposition Exhibit 20. And I'll ask you to take a look at the third page, which has a number on it of 00057. There's a chart down at the bottom. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
This chart shows, again, this is the data set from the 1991 FDA submission, the report we've been talking about today. And it indicates that there were no suicides on paroxetine during the controlled portion of the placebo-controlled trials that were the basis of that data set, and also shows there were no suicides on placebo during the controlled portion of the placebo-controlled trials that form the basis of that data set. Tell me what your view of it is, doctor, if you would.
Well, I see 0 over 921 and 0 on paroxetine and 0 over 554 for placebo.
And look back at the previous exhibit, if you would. Are the denominators of 921 and 554 the same denominator?
Yes, they are the same denominators.
If my statement is correct, that these were the numbers of completed suicides that occurred during the controlled portions of placebo-controlled trials that formed the data set that was included in the 1991 FDA submission.
Mm-hmm.
Does this allay any concerns you may have had about what Mr. Farber asked you earlier with respect to run-in suicides?
Yes, again, clearly. I mean, as I've already said, this is the right methodology, and it's showing very clearly to me anyway that there is no difference between drug and placebo.
And do these two documents I've shown you provide support for the opinion that you gave Mr. Farber earlier today that you did not believe that ingestion of Paxil induces suicidality? Yes or no?
As I have already indicated, that I find these data very important, very reassuring for myself, for patients, and for the company, and it clearly or nicely endorses the message that we were trying to give back in the early 90s.
Based on the same data?
Based on the same data set, just analysed a different way, a more appropriate way.
And of course, the company can also do an analysis based on patient exposure year to equalize for.
Yes.
And you mentioned one other thing a company might do is go and look at all the data it had up until the present to see what its suicide data shows for trials that occurred after 1989.
I did say that. I said I would like to see, because I don't know, as I said before, I don't know, but I assume the company has done further work in this area, and I'm not privy to, and to decide my position on the various revelations we talked about today. I would want to see that data to decide where I should be, where my thoughts should be.
But certainly based on the reanalysis of the 1991 data, your conclusion has not changed. That is, that Paxil does not induce suicidality.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, very much so.
And you were asked some questions about studies which were done and studies that weren't done. Why didn't the company do studies to see whether the drug can cause someone to become suicidal?
Well, the simple answer to that is in my belief, and that would be an ethical trial, and I think that there would be great difficulty in getting such a design past an ethics committee, or an institutional review board.
And what would the ethical concerns be?
Well, I mean, it seems a somewhat extreme thing to do is to give somebody a medication with the hope/expectation that you're going to induce or possibly precipitate suicide thoughts or actions. I mean, that would be really quite unacceptable, actually.
So the company never conducted a trial in which suicidality was the end point of the trial?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
Are you aware of any trials the company conducted in which it tried to determine whether taking Paxil might reduce suicidality in patients who are already suicidal?
Yes, I am.
What is your recollection of that?
Now, again, that would be clearly an ethical question to ask. can the various medications reduce suicidality? And my recollection is, that trial was conducted in countries where there were quite high suicide rates and therefore increasing the chance of observing any emergent suicidality. But the results of the trial, which I think, if I remember correctly, was reasonably sized anyway, was that there was no difference between drug and placebo.
And that was study 057?
I don't know. Could be.
In your opinion, was there sufficient clinical trial data available to the company to allow you to answer the question of whether Paxil caused people to become suicidal?
As of today?
Or as of the time you were there?
At the time I was there, I believe that it did not cause people to be suicidal based on the analysis we've shared. And now, having seen the further clinical trial work, which I've just literally seen today for the first time, it reassures and really endorses and confirms my original position.
Bearing in mind that the endpoint of the trial was not to determine whether people became suicidal, nevertheless, did the investigators collect information about suicidality on patients who were enrolled in the trials?
Now you're talking about the trials that were conducted for the MAA NDA.
Yes.
Those early trials.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, these were prospective, double-blind, randomized studies, and all events were collected in a prospective way, in a diligent and prospective way.
So, and were the investigators instructed to interrogate patients at each visit with respect to suicidality?
Yes, that was an important aspect of when you're running a depression study, that the investigators should be cognizant. Well, they are cognizant of the fact that patients their suicidality can worsen, and they should be alert to that and take appropriate action.
And were they instructed to faithfully record all adverse events, including suicide adverse events?
Absolutely.
Are you aware of any data that shows that patients taking Paxil are at a statistically significantly higher risk for suicide than patients taking placebo?
I'm not aware of that data, or any such data.
And did you see any evidence at any time while you were at Smithkline Beecham that led you to believe that a patient taking Paxil could be induced to become suicidal?
I didn't see any information, and I never formed the opinion that there was data available to indicate that was a reality.
And
No, I'm not aware of that.